Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. Several weeks ago, Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Zarif traveled once again to Moscow and met with his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov. As usual, they issued a most positive joint statement, but behind the nice words, there lies friction between these two actors in the Syrian conflict, among other regional sectors of operation. To discuss relations between Russia and Iran, we're joined from central Israel by Mr. Meir Javedanfar, who is an Iran lecturer at IDC Herzliya. Welcome. Also joining today's panel from elsewhere here in Jerusalem is Professor Zeev Khanin, who is an expert on Russian and Middle Eastern studies at Ilan and Ariel universities. Welcome.
Pleasure to be with you.
And with me here is our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren. Mr. Oren, give us a broader overview of these relations that seem to be continuously fluctuating over the course of the past decade and even more.
So we have followed the trajectory of Russian-Iranian relations, and of course, there is a lot of history behind it, with Russia or the Soviet Union being a threatening neighbor to Iran, at least until the Cold War was over. And then later, when the Iranian nuclear program started to be a factor, Russia tried to play a part with some compromise formulas being suggested to get the nuclear material to Moscow, from Tehran to Moscow, and so on and so forth. And, of course, Russia participated in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action 5 years ago. But the main arena is Syria right now. And we know that Russia is trying to call the shots. Iran has its own interests and ambitions. But the bottom line is that beggars cannot be choosers. And Iran is now in a position of begging for help. It must get help medically, economically, and diplomatically in order to break the encirclement which the Trump administration has been trying to maneuver around it. And therefore, Iran needs perhaps China. This is not our main topic today. But obviously, Iran cannot confront Russia head on, because Iran needs Russia much more than Russia needs Iran.
Indeed. I'd like to ask you, Professor Khanin, during the course of the Civil War, also following the entry of Russia into Syria in 2014, we could see there's been a lot of dialogue between Jerusalem and Moscow. There's been former Deputy Chief of Staff of the IDF, Yair Golan, flying to Moscow, establishing confliction or deconfliction understanding between the two militaries in order to avoid frontal confrontation in Syria, something that has really brought about more freedom of operation for Israel on the one hand, but on the other hand, it put the Russians in somewhat of a challenging position vis-a-vis the Iranians, who are being targeted on the other hand. So how do you see the Iranians actually communicate their frustrations with the Russians, and how do the Russians actually respond to those frustrations when we're talking about Syria proper?
Well, I would say that concerning my colleagues who commented the visit of Mohammad Zarif to Moscow, many of them defined the current track between Tehran and Moscow as a so-called alliance of isolated. So they see Moscow, the Russian regime, Vladimir Putin, as isolated, more or less, which has very problematic relations with the European Union, with the United States at the moment, not extremely good relations with the Middle Eastern powers. And from this point of view, they're, of course, interested to keep good relations on one hand with Tehran, and on the other hand with Jerusalem. And Iran is pretty isolated, according to them, in the Middle East and in the international community, which and I absolutely agree with Amir Oren, who said, on one hand, they are searching their way from the isolation, trying to strengthen their relations with Moscow, and on the other hand, to upgrade their relations with Beijing. From this point of view, in Moscow, answering your question, Jonathan, in Moscow, there are different towers of Kremlin, as we call them, so different interest groups in the Russian military, diplomatic, and political establishment. They're talking about three options. While military establishment is pretty ready to strengthen cooperation with Jerusalem, even at the expense of the cooperation between military cooperation between Russia and Iran, and that is why they are ready to continue and even develop the understandings of the Israeli operations in Syria. On the other hand, you have foreign policy establishment, diplomatic establishment, which in Smolensk Square believes that any cooperation with Israel should not be at the expense of Tehran. And in case there is a confrontation of interest between Iran and Israel, the Russia's choice should be Iran. From the third side, in Kremlin, the foreign policy elite, which is foreign policy branch of the presidential administration, they are trying to balance between these two approaches, meaning have a good relations with Tehran, not at the expense of Jerusalem, and with Jerusalem, not at the expense of Tehran. Whether it's possible, in principle, Zarif's visit to Moscow was officially declared as a way to continue this mutual strategic agreement, which was signed in 2001 and automatically prolonged every 5 years. So the next station is actually in 10 months from now. So now they're talking about a reform or deepening and widening of this agreement, and there's really a good question whether these two, meaning their strategic partnership in Tehran and their understanding in Jerusalem, goes together.
Mr. Javedanfar, how do you view this? To what degree do the Iranians also look at this and realize that on the one hand, there's been a historic mistrust between Tehran and Moscow, but on the other hand, Tehran is in dire need of Moscow in order to operate and withstand, if you will, the international pressures that have been crippling Iran on many levels?
Yes. Well, the way the Iranian leadership sees it is that Moscow, together with Beijing, they basically produce a very necessary counterweight for Iran against U.S. pressure in the international community. And now, of course, Iran and Russia have had, as you said, quite rightly said, Jonathan, have had a very difficult historic relationship. I don't want to get into it in this program, but for example, during the Shah, according to a former the head of the KGB in Tehran, who defected to the MI6 in the 80s, relations were so bad that at one stage Khrushchev planned to assassinate the Shah. They had the car filled with explosives, and the only reason they didn't kill the Shah was that there was a problem with the switch. The Shah didn't know this, but despite the relations being very, very bad, the Shah maintained relations with the Soviets because his doctrine was positive nationalism, basically working with both superpowers, with all countries, working with Israel at the same time as Egypt, because the way he saw it, the best way to attain to meet the national interest of Iran and his regime interest was to have relations with all countries. The current regime sees America as a threat and sees the U.S. soft power, especially, as an existential threat. And the same applies to the Chinese and the Russians, by the way. They also view soft revolutions instigated by the U.S. as the biggest threat. So I think there's a meeting of minds there. And at the same time, because the deep state in Iran, meaning the regime, has always viewed the U.S. with suspicion, even during the Obama administration, for them, it's very important to maintain relations with China and with Russia. Of course, that comes at a price because the Russians and the Chinese know Iran's not going to turn to the U.S. So they set the price. Iran's bargaining position is really limited because it basically it restricts the number of bidders, the number of suppliers. So there's a duopoly, basically. And these two players basically set the price for the relations with Iran. For now, as long as the deep state has a say over this matter, which it does, it will continue. But I have to say that there have been members of the government, the official government in Iran, who've not always been happy with the way Russia has treated Iran. Let's just give the example of the Bushehr nuclear plant. It was delivered 10 years later and $4 billion over budget. And there are people who are unhappy, but because the regime has more of a say, the deep state has a bigger say than the government, there's not that they can do. There's not that much that they can do right now.
Indeed. Mr. Oren, I'd like to hear the Israeli perspective, actually. How do they see the current situation between Moscow and Tehran? Is this something to worry about within the government halls here in Jerusalem? Or are they looking at it and understanding that Moscow is a superpower? It is playing in a multiple dimensional chessboard, and ultimately it is treating Israel in one way and Iran in another, separate from one another completely. Like we hear also, the dynamic is not one cohesive direction of the government in Moscow.
Israel does not view Russia in an adversarial fashion now. Of course, Russia was the patron of the Arab countries during the Cold War, and when Israel confronted Egypt, Syria, Libya, Iraq, and others. But this is all in the past. Right now, the relationship between the Israeli Defense Forces and the Russian armed forces, as was mentioned, is at least correct, probably even warmer. Both sides respect each other, know how to avoid any conflict, not to invade the respective spaces. But one should remember that because of the Russian bases in Syria, Russia, in a way, is now Israel's neighbor, much like Iran is now Israel's neighbor when it does not operate only through proxies, but sends forces of its own. So Israel has to juggle its operations in Syria in such a way that the Russians are informed in advance and keep out of the way, and the Syrians are being retaliated against when they try to intercept the Israelis, and the Iranians are being driven from the area adjacent to Israel. The Israelis do not mind if there are Iranians in the Idlib area working alongside Bashar Assad's regime and Russia against the opposition. But as long as it threatens Israel, Israel resists it. One more point. The American diplomatic move right now is aimed at the approaching end of the conventional munitions embargo on Iran. The Americans are trying unsuccessfully because of the veto in the Security Council to extend it. One thing they are telling Israel is that if this embargo is lifted, Russia is going to sell Iran arms for profit, and the Iranians are going to provide these arms to Hezbollah and others. But Israel is not trying to put any pressure on Russia. It doesn't have such leverage to avoid selling arms to Iran. This is between Moscow and Tehran. Jerusalem cannot butt in.
Indeed. Professor Khanin, I'd like to ask, there have been reports also in a paper in Saudi Arabia about growing dismay in Moscow about Iranian involvement in Syria. They've been bolstering their capacity in all kind of regions which their Russian counterparts are not very happy about, and also voiced their dismay to their Iranian counterparts. To what degree do you see this actually evolve into something more challenging for the relationship between those two countries? Do you see a growing apart, if you will, between Russia and Iran on several theaters, as they're not always aligned on their opinions when it comes, for instance, to Yemen or to Egypt or to Libya, for that matter?
Absolutely. Well, if you will come back to history, not so deep one, 5 years ago, when the massive Russian involvement was first seen in Syria, it was pretty clear that two allies, or three allies actually, the Syrian regime of Bashar Assad, Tehran and Moscow, divided the function in order to help the Bashar Assad regime to survive. As far as Russia is concerned, they believe that it will take a few months. Nobody thought it will take so many years, and it's not finished yet, by the way. And it was enough, as it was seen from Moscow, from the general staff headquarters of the Russian army, Ministry of Defense, and of course presidential administration, as well as the Foreign Office. It will be enough to send their Air Force, but as far as Tehran is concerned, they should send what is called the boots on the ground. And from this point of view now in Moscow, they're not very much happy as far as it became much more longer than I'd expected from the beginning of the so deep Iranian involvement. So at the moment, the biggest disagreement between Moscow and Tehran is actually the Russian program of reform of the official Syrian army, meaning that Russians insist that Iran will diminish as much as possible the so-called Shia militias, which they are pro-Iranian militias, which they use in order to reach their military goals, meaning first of all Hezbollah, but also two Iraqi brigades, Afghan brigades, Pakistani brigade, and instead of all this, and of course the Quds Corps, exactly Iranian one, and from at the exchange it with the new, well-equipped, well-trained, disciplined, and let's not put aside also another interest controlled through the Syrian regime with the help of the Russian officers and Russian generals at the exchange of all this Iranian presence there. In Tehran, they don't see it very favorably, I would say. They would prefer to keep the situation as is. From the second point of view, they're of course interested. There is a very deep disagreement in concern of foreign presence there. First of all, meaning Israeli, but even more than that, the presence of Turkey and the United States. In Moscow and in Tehran, see differently the recent attempts, or at least declarations, of possible rapprochement or founding any sort of agreement between Washington and Damascus. And if in Iran they see it very, very negatively and are not going to commit to their ally or to their satellite in Damascus any way of founding understanding and looking for understanding in Washington, for Moscow it is less critical. So this is the point which we should found an understanding of misunderstanding or the lack of understanding. Yeah. And finally, it's also a very good question: what will be the future? Meaning elections, reform of the security forces, economy, and so on and so forth. From this point of view, I would say that between Moscow and Tehran, more disagreements than agreements.
Indeed. Mr. Javedanfar, how do you view this? Do you also hear in Tehran some dismay with regard to the relations currently with Moscow? And to what degree do you see the cooperation between the Iranian armed forces and that of Russia and China, including a naval exercise that took place a couple of weeks ago in order to counter an American exercise with India and other exercises in the Persian Gulf as well? Do you see a certain two-street or a parallel approach towards Moscow with regard to their interests and, of course, their dismays?
You don't hear that much criticism of Russia in Iranian press because the Russians have the support of the deep state. You do hear it, but not very often. Of course, you hear much more criticism of the United States. One of the recent one, I think, was one that stands in basic one that I can remember one that comes to mind is, I think it was about 2 years ago, news that basically the Russians had told the Iranians that for any reconstruction project in Syria, we have a veto. So even if Bashar al-Assad gave a project for reconstruction to an Iranian company, the Russians can basically veto it if they don't like it. And yes, there was some criticism of that, but generally you don't hear that much criticism. In terms of the military relations between Iran and Russia and Iran and China, you have to remember that yes, we here in Israel, where we view the Iranian threat with concern, because the biggest threat, let's be honest, that Iran poses to us is the Hezbollah missiles. But they are the Hezbollah missiles. Iran itself doesn't have a very strong navy and doesn't have a very strong air force. So I don't know how much value these maneuvers have in terms of military value. Yes, they are sending a message to the United States, and it's expected and it's logical. The Russians don't like it that the Americans are improving relations with the Indians. The Chinese certainly don't like it, and we can imagine why. But in terms of how much Iran can offer, I think, in terms of the military weight that Iran can offer to these two countries, it's limited. What Iran can offer is geostrategic location. For example, there were reports that the Russian Air Force was using the air base at Hamadan to carry out strikes in Syria. For example, that would be important if it carried on. As far as we know, the Russians are not using it. There are also reports that maybe, and I have to say this is unconfirmed, so let's just put that in that category, that maybe as part of the deal with China that the Iranians are discussing, the Chinese will also be giving some strategic bases in Iran. Again, that's not confirmed. But should it happen, I think the weight of those for China or for Russia would be much bigger than military cooperation with Iran, because the key point here being that Iran's military is not very strong.
Indeed. If indeed the report that is not corroborated about Chinese military infrastructure in Iran, that would mean a new equation for regional power balance, if you will, Mr. Oren. Of course, the Americans look at the Chinese as the main challenge for regional conduct, if from a Western perspective at least, as opposed to the Russians, which they do not really view them as a big threat, but rather a small economy that is trying to maintain past glories. To what degree do you see, though, their growth of Russian involvement, in Libya, concerning to the African command of the United States military? Of course, it seems like the Americans are taking now Turkey's position more so than the other French position or NATO position, if you will, in Libya, something that seems to be also portrayed in other areas vis-a-vis the Russians and Iranians. How do you see all this come into play?
So when we are talking about the American position, we must recall that this is conditional. Perhaps come November, less than 3 months from now, or in January, when the next president is inaugurated, if it is not Donald Trump, perhaps this will change. But ironically, if you mention the Chinese and their penetration into the Middle East, they are emulating what the United States have been doing in the 1940s, when they first sent the Sixth Fleet into the Mediterranean. The Chinese, of course, are coming from the other direction. But until they establish themselves, it is important to note regarding the Russian-Iranian relationship. First of all, it is not a coalition of equals. Russia is leading the coalition in Syria, and the Iranians are junior partners regarding that. Secondly, the Iranians have more urgent problems such as Iraq, and they have to choose their priorities. And Syria is a priority for Russia, it is not for Iran. Iran wants to maintain its relationship with Hezbollah, of course, but not necessarily in Syria. And ever since the assassination of Qassam Soleimani, they have lost their focus on Syria.
Indeed. Nevertheless, I'm doubtful that the Iranians view themselves as junior partners when it comes to Syria or anywhere else, considering their investments in that place.
Yes, but the Russians have a way of letting other partners know who is senior and who is junior.
Indeed. Well, we're drawing near to the end of the program, so I'd like to give each and every one of you the opportunity to have a closing analysis for the near future. To what degree is this bond between Moscow and Tehran unshakable? Professor Khanin, we'll start with you.
Okay. So I believe that in the short run and maybe in the medium run, relations between two will be affected by 3 points. First of all, nuclear program and the question of provision of foreign armament to Iran. Second, situation in Syria. And, of course, founding the common ground between China, Iran, and Russia in concern of the continuation of the American and European sanctions against these 2 countries. And that probably will be the major question, or major answer to your question.
Mr. Javedanfar, your thoughts?
I think the relationship between the 2 sides will continue. Russia will be more important to Iran than Iran is to Russia. But as long as the deep state in Iran has a say over the foreign policy, it's not going that relationship is not going to change much.
Well, unfortunately, this is all the time that we have for today. So I'd like to thank Professor Khanin, Mr. Javedanfar, as well as Mr. Oren for being with us here today. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well. And we will see you next time.
You just watched TV7 Jerusalem Studio. We encourage you to pray for the challenges raised in today's program. If you were blessed by our production, please consider supporting TV7 Israel. The details of our respective bank accounts for donations from Europe and the United States appear on the screen. Your generosity allows us to continue to serve God's calling, to broadcast content that truly matters through TV7 Israel from Jerusalem.